Good evening, all together. Nice to see you all again. Tonight, Professor Vanessa Harding is among us already prepared. I have the pleasure to introduce her shortly, and then she can start already. She received her MA and PhD in St. Andrews, and she became a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London in 2009. She has held many prestigious positions, and among others is the British representative of the International Commission on the History of Towns, a council member of the London Record Society, and since 1991, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She is interested especially in the social and economic history of London, and of course of other cities, Paris, for example. And she has published extensively on topics related to family structures, particular areas of London, and demographic developments of this city. Currently, she is also working on a book-length study of the 17th century London and developing a project to map London on the eve of the Great Fire of 1666. Today, she will be talking about the role of guilds and fraternities in civic life, especially in the late medieval and early modern London. The floor is yours, Vanessa.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Suzanne, and thank you for the invitation to speak in this series. I'm going to start sharing my screen to put up my PowerPoint. Let's hope it worked 5 minutes ago. Let's hope it works now. Okay. When an institution is referred to by a variety of terms, this suggests that it has multiple facets or is hard to pin down to any single identity. And this is certainly true of urban guilds, which in medieval and early modern England might also be referred to as mysteries, fraternities, fellowships, companies, livery companies, societies, or crafts, as well as by the Latin versions of these terms. And in practice, it's difficult to attach a precisely differentiated meaning to any of these terms, which were sometimes used as if they were interchangeable. Different local and historical traditions favor different usages, so that one town and its historians may speak of guilds and another of companies, and in London we tend to speak of companies. Cautious modern writers may prefer generic terms such as association, despite the danger of blurring some of the characteristic features. Those who want to emphasize specific functions may use more concrete terms, even at the risk of invoking some unwanted connotations. And of course, long-lasting institutions, such as these guilds, may change their function over time and thus change the meaning of the name by which they're known. So all this is a preamble to emphasize that the institutions I'm talking about were varied, protean, evolving, and in many respects defy exact definition. Characteristics, experience, history, as well as names, will vary from place to place. But focusing on London will, I hope, both illuminate the factors that shape the guilds or companies there and offer some material for comparison with other places where institutions with similar names evolve differently. Most large towns and cities of the medieval and early modern period harbored a number of citizen associations, often, though not invariably, known as guilds, which played an important role in many aspects of the city's life. The function for which these associations are best known is that of representing or regulating the practitioners of a particular occupation or craft, but in fact they had many other important aspects. Most guilds began as voluntary associations of individuals for some social, religious, political, or economic purpose. None of these purposes was primary or common to all such associations, What was common was the sense of commitment, sometimes by a sworn oath, often by a financial contribution, to a shared objective. Some borrowed the language of family, with members calling each other brother and sister, and most of them had some kind of shared festivity. Guilds and fraternities for all purposes seem to have proliferated in towns in whose populous and changing environment the need for association and mutual support was perhaps more keenly felt, but they were not confined to urban societies. Associations of craftsmen and traders formed in many towns. The pressures which drove craftsmen and traders to form guilds included neighbourliness and the need for mutual moral support, and a religious fraternity lay at the heart of many such associations. Craft guilds cannot always be clearly distinguished from religious fraternities, especially where locality helped to define membership, given the tendency for men of the same craft to live near one another. But if a religious fraternity existed, it could well become the instrument through which, at a subsequent date, economic or political ends were pursued. In other cases, it's clear that economic pressures, the challenge of interlopers, for example, or the risks of distant trading, or the need to secure supplies of raw materials from monopolist distributors, first brought fellow craftsmen to act together, and the social and religious aspects of their association came later, strengthening their bonds. The craft associations began to diverge from the voluntary origins of the guild when they obtained monopolies of manufacture or retail trade, or control over the access to citizenship. The development of formal apprenticeship systems also contributed to this. The control any guild or craft association exercised over any single field of economic activity was never complete, and there was much jockeying for advantage. But by the later Middle Ages, most large towns had fairly complete systems of guilds to which citizens belonged and through which much economic and political activity was organized. The larger the town or city, the greater the number and diversity of craft associations. Middle-sized towns might have 6 or a dozen such associations and perhaps one merchant guild. In early 15th century London, as this document shows, there were over 100, though some of them were very small and fleeting. And this list, kept in the Brewers' Company's book of 1422, ranges from the wealthy and powerful, such as the Mercers, down to the Burlsters, who were fish sellers, who probably had no formal constitution or organization at all. 69 formally organized guilds or companies were named in a list of 1501, and at least another 9 existed at that date. A similar number existed in 1537 to 8, but the lineup changed over time as individual associations formed, merged, split, or even ceased to function. Membership figures are not always given in these lists, and even when they are, they're not necessarily accurate. But in the early 16th century, the London companies ranged from the large mercantile ones, such as the Mercers, Drapers, Merchant Tailors, with over 200 or 250 members, through middling-sized ones, such as the Brewers, the Barber Surgeons, the Butchers, and the Leather Sellers, with over 100, down to small ones with only a few dozen members. And this last group included such specialized crafts as bead makers, curers, the makers of woolen caps, and cobblers, and victualling occupations such as pastelers, fruiters, and cheesemongers. By 1500, all of London's craft guilds, which were generally by then known as companies, identified themselves with a branch of economic activity over which they claimed jurisdiction, regulating practitioners in their own interests and also ostensibly those of the wider civic community. The company's aspiration to detailed supervision of their members' activity is documented in the ordinances registered with the city in the 1480s and 1490s, such as this one, the ordinances of the pouch makers. Every aspect of work, from winter and summer hours to the purchase of materials to the number of apprentices a master could take, might be included in these ordinances. Fines for infractions were split between the company and the city, thus underlining the fact that the company's powers were devolved rather than prescriptive. A common characteristic of most companies was their internal governance, with a master or wardens elected on a regular basis, supported by clerical and administrative staff. In many companies, former office holders came to constitute an elite group or court of assistants who became a permanent source of authority in the company. An increasing number of companies had more than one rank of membership, with the majority of ordinary householders as the middle rank, above the wage earners, who might be known as bachelors or journeymen, and below the wealthier or more distinguished masters who wore a common livery and shared other privileges of status. At least 47 London companies had a livery division by 1501. The livery gown was one of the marks of fellowship and status, and liverymen were usually required to wear theirs on all formal occasions, and indeed fined if they failed to do so. The colours of these gowns varied, but they were uniform within a company at a particular time. As expensive and treasured items, livery gowns are quite often mentioned in wills. A few companies had an intermediate stratum of men allowed to wear the hood, but not yet the gown. And hoods and gowns were one of the external signifiers of group identity when companies participated in civic ceremonial. Regular meetings for business were enhanced by shared worship and periodic conviviality, with an annual election day feast playing a large part in the collective life of many companies. Feasts were enhanced by a dazzling display of plate, and several of the larger and wealthier companies required incoming freemen or liverymen to contribute a silver spoon or plate to the common stock. From the 14th century onwards, the larger companies acquired through donation and bequest a considerable amount of real property. And with the rent income and members' subscriptions, they built halls for their meetings and celebrations and maintained a lavish communal life. They also devoted money to charitable and pious purposes, especially chantries and commemorations for deceased members before the Reformation, and sermons, lectureships, scholarships, and schools in later years. A number of companies obtained royal charters confirming their holdings of property and their control of a particular activity, though royal charters didn't always prove a secure defense. The modest resources of the smaller companies of artisans kept their communal activities to a small scale, and they always remained more concerned with the regulation of their specific craft than with these other activities. In consequence of the increasing complexity of their membership and activities, the companies instituted and maintained a high level of record keeping, and it's thanks to this that we know so much about their activities. Charters and books of ordinances embodied the company's identity and standing, and together with title deeds to properties, were treasured and carefully preserved. Membership lists were both management tools and expressions of collective identity and memory. The records of apprentice bindings and enfranchisements served similar purposes. Rentals and accounts, such as the ones we've just seen, memorialized assets and documented faithful stewardship of shared resources, while the annual audit of accounts combined both practicality and symbolism. Minutes of court meetings created a narrative of activities. It's interesting that many companies in the later Middle Ages acquired or had made for them manuscripts of urban chronicles, suggesting a sense of commitment to a civic and not merely a company community. One of the most important functions of the London companies was their control of access to citizenship. The City of London's Charter of 1319 specified that new freemen must be vouched for by members of the occupation they intended to practice. As the companies developed formal identities and constitutions over the 14th and 15th centuries, they built in this civic responsibility into formal procedures of presentation and oath-taking, including being visibly present when apprentices were granted their freedom as citizens. And what I'm showing here is an extract from the city's freedom rolls of the middle of the 16th century. The registration and supervision of apprenticeship became one of their most consistent concerns. yielding, among other things, the records of enrolments and freedoms on which so many studies of migration are based. Company control of apprenticeship was a way of regulating standards of training. For example, apprentices were turned over to other masters if for some reason the first master failed to teach the craft. And most companies limited the number of apprentices any master could have at one time. But the whole procedure also helped to instill respect for the company's authority. An apprentice who successfully served a 7 or 8 year term and achieved the freedom of his company and the city had made a significant investment in those institutions. His commitment to their ethos, his expectation of future benefits from membership were comparably high. In addition, apprenticeship helped to build a network of patrons and relationships within a particular trade. Reputation and creditworthiness were essential for starting up in business. And in fact, many apprentices were effectively surrogate sons to their masters. So the management of apprenticeship and the inculcation of civic values was one major contribution the companies made to civic order. Masters exercised strict paternalistic discipline over their apprentices, and when they failed to control them, were held responsible for their actions. But more generally, companies disciplined their own members, imposing standards of behavior, enforcing obedience to regulations, and respect for the company's hierarchy, arbitrating disputes between members so as to keep them from the public courts. The companies were more explicitly used by the city as agents of government when they were delegated tasks such as crowd control during royal entries, or called on to supply men for a guard of honour for the civic hierarchy. Guilds and companies also typically made an important contribution to the cost and organisation of civic display, whether this took the form of plays and pageants, or Corpus Christi processions, as in many provincial cities, or of royal entries and mayoral shows, as in London. The companies played a vital part in staging such ceremonies, and their own gifts to a new monarch or visiting dignitary in cash, plate, or other valuables supplemented those made by the city government. The companies organised their members' participation in the city's annual Midsummer Watch, a moving pageant with armed men, giants, musicians, and lights accompanying the civic hierarchy around the city. 68 companies were charged with providing cressets or lights for the watch in 1540, though the 4 poorest companies were excused from doing so. The livery company, to which the incoming Lord Mayor belonged, was responsible for planning and financing the show that accompanied him to take his oath of office to the Crown's representatives, a ceremony that grew increasingly complex and theatrical, especially after the mid-16th century, when the Midsummer Watch ceased to be held. At a more private level, and continuing on from medieval practices, the companies played a large part in funeral ceremonies for deceased members, attending their processions in livery robes and sometimes hosting funeral dinners or commemorative drinkings at the hall. This image is from the funeral procession for Sir Philip Sidney, and it was a carefully choreographed event that brought the companies and their respect and resources into a very well-staged political performance. The company's knowledge of and authority over their members made them very useful as intermediaries for the collection of taxation and loans, both civic and national. The city government often chose to turn to the companies to raise money rather than assessing the citizens through the wards. In general, they found this answered well. While the companies didn't like being taxed, they were reluctant to lose face publicly by pleading poverty. So fractions of the total sum required were allocated between the companies in a rough representation of their contemporary wealth, but not an exact one. The companies then had the responsibility for raising that sum from their own members, and they could choose how they did so. In 1541 and 1582, the companies were assessed for contributions to the city's obligation for the nationally imposed lay subsidy. As with most tax assessments of the time, the sums recorded represent a low proxy for actual wealth, with the smallest companies not being listed at all, though all citizens and company men would have been liable for these subsidies as individuals. The company's resources were used to supplement the cities in many ways. On 26 occasions between 1570 and 1590, around 50 companies were assessed by the city for furnishing men, military harness, grain, or gunpowder. As many as 60 companies contributed to furnish men and arms to make a show before the Queen at Greenwich in 1572. In 1587, 55 companies were assessed to raise money for the purchase of 10,000 quarters of wheat, and on other occasions in the 16th century, the leading companies were required to buy and hold stocks of grain on behalf of the city for release at artificially low prices in case of dearth. The companies also had a more formal part to play in civic government. For a brief period in the turbulent 14th century, between 1376 and 1384, the craft guilds were the constituencies from which the city's common council was elected before the merchant elite reasserted its grip and elections reverted to the wards. Later on, it was the body of liverymen who made up the assembly known as Common Hall that elected the mayor and other officials, oversaw the city's financial audit, and elected members of parliament. Now, confining this to the liverymen effectively disenfranchised members of the smaller companies with no livery division, who participated only at ward level and on an individual basis, though that's actually not to undermine the importance of the citizen householder, who was also by necessity a company member in government at the very local level. In practice, all higher civic office holders would have been liverymen in their own companies. London's cursus honorum included both company office holding and civic office, and it's likely that every alderman, for example, also served as master or warden of his company at some time. A custom developed by the 16th century, by which only members of one of the 12 leading livery companies, the so-called Great 12, could hold aldermanic office or the mayoralty, thus further entrenching the power of the mercantile guilds. If a man started his civic life by joining one of the lesser companies, but then began to move up through the hierarchy, he would normally have to translate to one of the greater companies before he could continue his rise to the top. It was in this context that the ceremonial order of precedence among the companies was established in the early 16th century. And this was based on status and wealth at the time, not on antiquity of foundation or even the number of members. The mercers, many of whom were prosperous merchant adventurers, came first, followed by the grocers, drapers, and fishmongers, all essentially mercantile occupations. The skinners and merchant tailors agreed to alternate at 6 and 7. The Vintners, who in the 13th and early 14th centuries were probably the wealthiest and most politically influential guild, came in at 11 by the early 16th century, with the cloth workers, formed from the union of fullers and shearmen in 1528, number 12. It's also about this time that company heraldry was firmly established, with coats of arms and badges used extensively on company buildings, documents, and pageantry. And any walk around the City of London today will find these badges stuck on a significant number of buildings. Although the discourse of company membership was one of fraternity and fellowship, of the mutual benefits of submitting to governance, and the moral and social support that membership gave, the companies existed in tension with one another and with the city government. There were inevitable demarcation disputes, for example, between the cordwainers and the cobblers over the difference between repairing and remaking shoes, and arguments over the quality of materials or workmanship between companies controlling different stages of the production process. Though the companies shared control of access to citizenship, they still clashed over membership. Each company wished both to compel all practitioners of their craft to join the company and to maintain the right of members to practice other occupations if they chose. The city likewise oscillated between defending what was called the custom of London, which allowed a citizen to practice any craft, regardless of the company to which he belonged, and supporting the company's claims to exclusive jurisdiction. The tendency, though, was to permit merchants and dealers to exercise their trade within any company, and this was confirmed by an Act of Common Council in 1634, but to favour enforced membership of particular artisan companies. Translation from one company to another was possible, but not usually very easy. It was even more difficult for groups of members to secede and form a new company, though some succeeded in doing so, usually on the grounds that they had developed a distinctive new area of activity that was inadequately represented by the parent company. The Society of Apothecaries and the Distillers' Company established their independence from the powerful Grocers' Company, largely dealers in spices, drugs, and strong waters, in 1617 and 1638, respectively, for example, but only after long struggles to do so. More serious tensions, however, existed both between and within companies as a result of economic inequalities. While the rhetoric of company membership upheld the independent craftsman, in practice, production was governed by a hierarchy of economic relationships. Most companies had some members who were dealers or engrossers rather than producers, and whose control of materials and prices meant that lesser craftsmen were not much more than piece workers or outworkers. Equally, even if they were not employers, the dealers were usually wealthier men in positions of power within the company, so their exercise of authority might be or might be seen to be biased against the interests of the majority of members. The companies of skinners, merchant tailors, haberdashers, and cloth workers all fall into this category, with a large artisan membership subject to mercantile leaders, but it was also true of many smaller companies. A rift opened between artisan cloth workers and their company's leaders in the later 16th century, when the leaders, who included several wealthy merchant adventurers, failed to defend the artisans' interests against those of the cloth exporters on the question of the export of unfinished broadcloths. Similarly, mercantile and dealing companies came to dominate producing ones, sometimes in directly obvious ways. The Leather Sellers Company succeeded in absorbing the toyers, the pursers, the glovers, and the pouchmakers between 1479 and 1517 to emerge as the leading company dealing in leather and leather goods in the early 16th century. And more generally, the political preeminence of companies such as the mercers, drapers, grocers, or goldsmiths ensured that city policy attended to mercantile rather than artisan interests. Although any account of work and employment in medieval and 16th century London has to begin with the city companies, the same is not true of the later 17th and 18th centuries. In crude terms, the companies lost their claim to monopoly control of skilled employment opportunities as their numbers and membership failed to keep up with the rapid demographic growth of the capital. London expanded from perhaps 50,000 inhabitants in 1500 to over 500,000 by 1700, spreading far beyond the boundaries of the city's jurisdiction. Up to 2/3 of adult male Londoners were citizens and company members in the mid-16th century, but probably fewer than 1 in 5 were by the 1690s. Tens of thousands of men and women practiced crafts, opened shops, and traded retail and wholesale by the late 17th century, in the late 17th century metropolis, without reference to the companies. Classic explanations of the decline of guilds and companies in the early modern period used to focus on institutional rigidity and self-defeating hostility to changing economic realities in the outside world. More sympathetic interpretations acknowledge that few institutions were able to adapt to the pace and scale of London's demographic and geographical growth, and that the companies operated in an increasingly difficult environment. A profusion of new manufactures, new modes of production, and more service and casual employment changed the nature of work and challenged the assumed primacy of the domestic workshop. The popular genre of cries of London of the mid-17th and later 17th century suggests that views of working Londoners had shifted from the man in the workshop to the man or woman on the street. Companies seeking to exert economic control over activity in the spreading suburbs received some but limited support from the city or national government, and developments in the 1630s and 1680s, when city and crown were at odds, further undermined the company's reach and their capability for imposing their search on the suburbs. The growth of new forms of economic organisation, the regulated trading companies, of which the merchant ventures were an early example, joint stock enterprises such as the Levant and East India companies, consortia of monopolists or patentees like the soap makers or the starch makers. These cut across loyalties to traditional guilds and companies and provided alternative circles of association and interaction. Craft company membership certainly declined in relative terms over the 16th and 17th centuries. The balance of costs and benefits became less favourable to membership. Its attractions must surely have been weakened as the companies proved powerless to protect members against trade slump or against capitalistic exploitation. The company's problems with non-free practitioners dated back to the Middle Ages, but the less able they were to enforce regulation, the less incentive there was for anyone to submit to their discipline. A sense of mutuality was certainly undermined by the increasing stratification and hierarchy of company membership in the later 16th and 17th centuries. Altruistic economic collaboration within companies, limiting individual advantage and sharing opportunities, had always been something of a myth, but perhaps it became even less plausible in early modern London. I've included this slide to remind us that the Fire of London was a major blow to the city companies, most of which lost their halls and many of which lost a lot of their landed investment, so that it took them a good number of years to recover. But if all the factors that militated against the company's continued effectiveness are listed, then their decline can seem overdetermined. It's important to remember that they did in fact survive, and they remained an important force in city life through the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th centuries, with a firm hold on many key areas of the urban economy, as well as remaining the mediators of citizenship. Membership numbers increased, especially in the textile companies, even if not in proportion to London's growth. The drapers had 2,106 members in 1617, while the merchant tailors had an estimated 2,673 in 1595. The model of traditional company organisation remained attractive to the city and to the crown, as well as to craft practitioners. The brick and tile makers, for example, petitioned in 1634 for incorporation as a company to govern their craft within 20 miles of London, citing the badness of stuffs now usually made and the advantage of reducing building in timber. They also offered the king a bonus of 6 per 1,000 bricks and tiles sold. New companies continued to be formed for new manufactures and specialisms, such as clockmaking in 1631, needlemaking in 1656, and felt making in 1667. Other companies, such as the joiners, who were furniture makers, experienced a boost in numbers and importance after the fire as people restocked and refurnished their houses. Over 70 city companies were in existence at the end of the 17th century, with thousands of members between them. Competition within and between companies continued to be fierce because success for example, in winning exclusive control of an activity or process, conferred real benefits. Sorry. The story of how the companies survived the longueur of the 18th century and the attacks on privilege and vested interest of the 19th century is not one for now, but outside their economic role, they remained important fora for social interaction and mutual charity, supporting needy members with start-up loans, alms and pensions. Those that had taken on the management of schools and almshouses had compelling reasons to keep functioning. Company halls remained a focus for ceremonial and celebratory activity, as well as administration, and were rebuilt after the fire in the 19th century and even after the Second World War. The continuing flow of bequests and endowments indicates that company membership could still be an important part of a citizen's identity, and some companies, largely the wealthier mercantile ones, controlled and still control considerable resources, influence, and power. Thank you.
We are back in the big circle. Thank you, Vanessa. There is now a discussion. Yes, there is also applause. There is now the opportunity to discuss with Professor Harding, and as always, we are giving the students the priority. So please prepare your questions, and you can raise your hand or you write in the chat, and then Maria and me will observe. There is, I see the hand of Karen Stark.
Hello. Thank you, Vanessa, very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I have two questions for you. The first one is, you had mentioned the religious aspects of the guilds. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that, and if that included founding chapels or altars. And then my second question would be about, I'm not sure what the composition of London was at that time, but were there any barriers or divisions of fraternities and guilds based on cultural background, or having to be a native English person or vice versa? Thank you.
Thank you for both those questions, Karen. The second one is easier to answer, is that London is actually really quite an open society. It does allow people from all over countries, the country under the King of England's rule, to join as citizens. It does treat aliens differently, and it doesn't directly allow them to become citizens. There's no other sort of barrier that I can think of, though there is a strong sort of prejudice in favor of apprenticeship as the means to become a citizen. I mean, something like 9/10 of all citizens get there by that means. And it is built into the Constitution in that only those who have become citizens through apprenticeship are allowed to become aldermen. So you can't, as it were, buy your way in as an adult and then move up through the city hierarchy. But otherwise, I mean, apart from the exemption of aliens, which, you know, is common to all sorts of civic rights across Europe, it is pretty open to people, and it seems to attract a very wide range of young men to become apprentices from across England and Wales and ultimately Scotland as well. On the question of religion and the religious aspects, yes, this is often very important to the companies. Many of them have a religious fraternity at their heart. Most of them have a particular relationship with either an altar or a saint or a parish church. Only one or two actually have chapels of their own, though they do sometimes have side chapels in a parish church. But their celebrations, certainly up to the Reformation, normally include church going and normally include some kind of after the Reformation tend to still include church going, but sermons rather than masses. And many of them in the Middle Ages become essentially the repositories of bequests to support chantries, obits, and other foundations. So the Reformation, they find themselves challenged by the Crown as to whether their extensive landholding is there for, as it were, charitable purposes such as education, or religious purposes such as maintaining chantries and obits. And if it's the latter, and they're unable to pretend otherwise, then they will lose that to the Crown.
Okay, thank you. Then I see a question in the chat from Karen Culver. Do you want to read it yourself? Otherwise,
right. Yes. Guilds have been called closed shops. How easy for a master craftsman, master merchant to move to another town or country, establish a business in a new location? Well, it's certainly possible within England. It is possible to acquire citizenship is the key, through redemption, through purchase. And it looks as though at times of major flows of population to London, then there are skilled adults as well as young men coming to join the city. But London, I think, is perhaps unusually open, unusually keen to attract skilled workers. Other places may be more restrictive. In terms of moving from country to country, then I think this is complicated by the whole question of allegiance and alien status.
Okay. Then there is another question in the chat. Richard.
Right.
Here.
Okay.
Thanks for an excellent paper, Vanessa. I wondered if you could expand a little more on the relationship between the livery companies and other organizations, such as the Merchant Adventurers and later the East India Company. Was it one of cooperation or competition?
Yes, this is always a confusing one. In a sense, one could say that they're actually such different objectives and entities that they're not really in competition, but they're also not really in cooperation either. So that in order to join one of those trading companies, people normally have to be a citizen. Sorry, to become a merchant adventurer of London, you need to be a citizen, which means you need to be a company member. The merchant adventurers, though, are a national organization or international organization, but within England, the majority of merchant adventurers are Londoners, and the majority of London merchant adventurers are members of the Mercers Company. So there's a very substantial overlap between being a mercer and being a merchant adventurer, to the extent that the merchant adventurers meet at Mercers Hall, and indeed some of their rather poor surviving records are actually among the Mercers archive. So that sense that you can be both, and that, but that in a sense your emotional attachment would, I think, be to the Mercers rather than to the merchant adventurers. That the companies are much better at inspiring this sense of loyalty and belonging and identity. When the joint stock companies come along, such as the Levant Company, the East India Company, and so on, again, merchants of London are all members of city companies, mostly again of half a dozen of the leading mercantile companies, mercers, drapers, grocers, and so on. So again, I think it's a sort of parallel. The complication, I think, arises when people, when young men are apprenticed to a member of, they're formally apprenticed to a member of a livery company, but in practice, they're really apprenticed to somebody because he is a member of one of the trading companies. And quite whether there is any clash between those jurisdictions is a bit harder to find. I think it would be normally the case that the livery companies would control, as it were, the parameters of apprenticeship, including admission to the season, to the city, to citizenship. But I think there may well be areas in which we can't say exactly what's going on, either because it's not documented or because it's just really rather a grey area.
Everybody is writing in the chat today.
Okay.
Andrea, would you like to?
Okay. So Andrea is asking about the relationship between the City of London Authority and Southwark and how this changed in the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, in the middle of the 16th century, there is a major change in that the city takes over a significant part of Southwark. That's to say, it acquires the property just near to the end of London Bridge. Sorry, it acquires jurisdiction over the area around the end of London Bridge, and it also takes over various liberties that have been hitherto been controlled by the Crown. And I think this is important to the city because it gives it a greater reach, greater authority over areas in its immediate vicinity. But these never become fully part of the city in the same way that the area north of the river does. So although the ward of Bridge Without, a new ward is created for that part of Southwark around the bridge, it actually doesn't have the same internal democratic structure as the wards north of the river. And ultimately, it is separated from the City of London. So it's part of the city, but it's somehow not quite an equal part with the rest. But the broader question is really, well, the broader issue is about the relationship between the city and the areas outside its immediate jurisdiction. And it seems to have a fairly ambivalent view as to whether it's prepared to take on these poorer and more unruly areas in the interest of extending its control, or whether, and this is really what happens, it prefers to continue to hold a narrower, wealthier, more orderly area and to leave the suburbs to grow and develop on their own.
Thank you. Martin, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Vanessa. That was really fascinating, I thought, and really wonderful how you gave this broad overview, but then also these more specific examples. I found that really illuminating. I had two questions, one quite broad and the other quite specific. The first one is, if you could say a bit more somehow how this specifically urban environment influenced these companies. So you mentioned that just the sheer number was higher in larger cities in a way, but I also wondered what other features of urban life in a sense we can see have an impact here. For example, in terms of urban spaces, how this urban density, at least before the Great Fire, might have led to concerns about property prices or things like that, the number of people and so on, how that influenced these kinds of companies. I hope that makes sense. How the sort of other features, I guess, of urbanity or of urban life, how they might have impacted these companies. And then I just have to ask about the dead, of course. So I wanted to know if, besides these processions you mentioned, where the companies and guilds and so on are involved, if they also had an impact on the placement of the dead. So were there specific areas which were reserved for them, and how that worked with the placement of the dead of particular members and so on. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. It's nice to see you again. Yes, how does the urban environment influence the companies? I think I find it really rather hard to separate that. I just think of them as being so much an urban phenomenon, or so deeply embedded in their surroundings that it's quite hard to unpick different influences. I suppose, I mean, one thing, and that this is true of urban craftsmanship in general, and not just urban, not just the guilds and companies, is that proximity is a way of making efficiencies in the production process. So that the closeness of the people who make different parts or different stages in production, I think is quite important. I think Derek Keane said something about that the London street is essentially the factory is that things pass along the street or pass through quite narrow neighborhoods in order to be finished off. And that the clustering of fellow workers does seem to me to be something that, well, the clustering of people working at particular crafts, I think is probably quite important to how they operate. And it would be a way of both enhancing their mutual dependence, but also emphasizing the need for some kind of structure of control and discipline that monitors and manages their interactions. So I suppose there are other things such as particular crafts or particular companies have different locational characteristics. So, bakers tend to be scattered all over the city, as you might expect, but craftsmen tend to cluster together. Those who are operating large, dangerous, noisome or noxious processes will tend to be pushed out to the suburbs or to the waterfront because of their impact. And again, I suppose you could say this is what's coming down from above. This is where the city is stepping in to make manufacturing or production within the town to make it comply with some of the other demands of town dwellers. When it comes to burial, before the Reformation, many but not all of leading Londoners choose to be buried in their parish churches, but they're also at that time being buried in some of the friaries, so that there's no sort of single city pantheon where the elite are buried. But after the Reformation, most of them are buried in their parish churches, and that therefore there is that flow of endowments, of grandiose monuments, and so on to the parish churches, but not to every parish church. I mean, London has more than 100 parish churches, but it's the parishes in the city centre that benefit most from this flow of benefactions. In terms of where company men might be buried, I don't find much in the way of company men who live in one parish asking to be buried in another because of the association with a company that's based there. The only exception to that is that the Mercers Company has a chapel which they use for burial, and that mercers from other parts of the city might well choose to be buried there. But apart from that, there isn't really a traffic in the bodies of citizens and company men to find a parish church that is closer to their identity as a company man. It tends to be family or former residence or something like that lies behind such movements.
Thank you.
Okay. At the moment, I can't see other hands, so I take myself the opportunity, Vanessa, to. There is Vanina Koch, please. Hello.
Nice to see some few known faces. Thank you for this talk. I was really fascinated by the development of London, of which I know not a lot. I've worked on French sources, and there is an ongoing discussion among French historians of corporations, of guilds and confraternities on the role of women in these associations. There are cities like Rouen or Paris who have also guilds who are exclusively feminine. There are other confraternities that accept women as members. We do have from Flanders and Paris, for example, apprentice contracts for women who start to become apprentices. We have confraternities that then accept the widows of the male member as member of their confraternity. So there are certainly geographical differences in that, and probably also, especially for the late Middle Ages, lacuna due to sources material. Of course, the early modern period is more lucky in that respect. So my question was very broadly just to ask, what is the situation in London? Do we have any evidences of women in guilds, of guilds run by women, of the situation in confraternities, of widows? Are there any evidences? Is this something to explore? Maybe there is already a huge bibliography on that, which I just don't know because I've been working on continental sources. Thank you.
Thank you. There's not a huge bibliography, but there is something. I think in London, it would be true to say that women and females are allowed to join religious fraternities and confraternities, and particularly parish fraternities, which talk about brothers and sisters and record their names and so on. I'm not sure that they hold office at any time, and they obviously can't perform some of the religious functions that those do, but they definitely belong to them. When it comes to the craft associations, the ones that become these formal companies, then women have a much smaller part to play. They are wives, and widows are allowed to continue their late husband's business, including finishing training his apprentices. They're not normally allowed to take on new apprentices, but they can at least see out the ones that they've got. And that, you find in the wills of widows of company men that they're making provision for their apprentices just as their late husbands would have done. They don't hold city office. And at different times, there are tensions about whether women are doing work that ought to be done by men. So there are, particularly in the 16th century, I think when London's growing and there is perhaps, if I put it otherwise, in the 15th century, when there is perhaps a shortage of population, it seems quite likely that women, the wives and daughters of guildsmen, may have a more substantial role to play in whatever the local business is. By the 16th century, the city and the companies are seeking to restrict what they do, saying, wives must not do this on behalf of their husbands, daughters must not be sent to do so and so. They still play an important part, but it's a much less visible one, I think, by the 16th and 17th centuries. There are a number of female apprentices and apprenticeships, both in the Middle Ages and into the 16th and 17th centuries. And some of them are to women or to husbands to learn the craft of the wife when the wife has a separate occupation, which is likely to be something to do with needlework or silk making, silk embroidery. But they are very few and far between compared to the thousands of men that we know, of young men that we know about. There's no craft guild of women, but there is an association of silk women, which seems to be, it's not exactly the same as a city company, and it doesn't have many of the other roles that I've been talking about that the city companies do. It looks as though it is largely run by the wives or widows of wealthy mercers and merchants who are dealers in silk, and that what they're doing is putting out and developing a silk weaving industry. And this is not silk textiles, it's small items such as purses and girdles and so on. But that's the closest that there is, I think, in London, in medieval London, to there being a guild for women per se.
Thank you. There are a few strong parallels to what French historians are discussing for female guilds and the role of women in confraternities. Thank you for that.
Thank you both. Even if there are still questions about citizenship, I wanted to ask something. You mentioned in the first part of your talk you said something like there was a high level of record keeping. I just wondered, I noted that down because this is not very usual, as you probably know. There are towns where you have this kind of pragmatic writing only in later times, if at all. How do you explain that, the fact that you have in London a relatively early practice of record keeping?
I think it's probably at least partly to do with this highly competitive atmosphere, and that having a clerk and keeping your records is partly a statement of having arrived, of identity, but also just a simply practical, pragmatic thing, that it's important once they start wanting to keep track of their members or raising money. I think perhaps it is particularly their role in discipline and their role in fundraising that makes this most important. And the fact that, as I say, an increasing number of them come to be property holders on behalf of deceased members, for chantries, for endowments of various kinds. That again means that they have to keep these muniments of title. They spend a lot of time collecting rents. They need to keep a view of what's going on. I mean, I don't want to overstate it and say that, you know, all of these 100-odd companies have any kind of record at all, but a sufficient number of them do. I mean, I can't tell you offhand if it's, you know, if it's 50 that have something from before the Reformation, but it could be. It would vary. It varies very much from one company to another, what they've got, what they've kept. But it's interesting that there's a very high level of survival despite the fire. A few companies lost material in the fire. Others have lost archives at later dates, like individual fires at their hall, and some were lost in the Second World War. But on the whole, it's actually pretty high level of survival. And most of them have now deposited them in Guildhall Library, now London Metropolitan Archives, but half a dozen of the largest ones still keep an archivist and an archive. And in a sense, they're because they are still operating as managers of property, as managers of schools, as businesses effectively, this is really their working archive. This is really important to them to maintain it.
Yeah, thank you. So Kati is next.
Oh, thank you very much, Vanessa, for this broad overview. And it also joins discussions, even if you didn't refer to them explicitly, on the economic efficiency versus the social importance of the guilds. And you seem to have voted for the latter. But what do you think about the ideas expressed by economists, especially like North and Grafe and others, about the efficiency of guilds?
Yes, I did steer clear of that, and this question of whether guilds are a good thing, which is one of the, as it were, overtones of some of that debate. My feeling in London is that their greatest value is the social one. That's to say, is that they're part of the architecture of society, of London society, and that they form a way, they supply a means of articulating relationships and of organizing people in a comparatively benevolent way that helps the city to remain a fairly coherent and cohesive entity despite a large number of strains and stresses. Whether they are, I mean, I don't actually think that they are a particularly efficient way of managing the economy. They serve adequately. Their rhetoric is obviously one of efficiency, effectiveness, public benefit, and so on. And I think that they rarely really live up to that. And that ultimately, I mean, even by the 16th and 17th centuries, they're becoming institutions that are for the benefit of their members, and that's what sustains them, rather than that they have any major outward benefit, it seems to me. But I'm not sure that anybody really claims that the London guilds have a major, are economically efficient institutions, because I'm not sure that they're really pretending to be that themselves.
Thank you, Vanessa. Other questions? Or no? Perhaps we could take this opportunity, Vanessa, and come back to our overall topic, like urban governance, and also this, you mentioned it as a term, citizenship. Is this, can you perhaps explain it a bit more in a detail? Is it first being a master and then getting citizenship, or is it coming from a family and then who is already a citizen and then having possibility to enter into a guild and or other fraternity? So is there a fee? Is there a level, a high level, that so that not everybody, not every craftsman can afford it? So perhaps just to make it a bit more illustrative how it works in London.
Yes, it is fairly open. It's not enormously expensive, but you can only become a citizen either by serving an apprenticeship and being presented, therefore, and becoming free of the company and then being made free of the city with the sponsorship of your company, or you can claim it through patrimony. That's to say, if you were born when your father was a freeman, you can claim freedom of the city on those grounds. But not everybody who's entitled to do that actually does so, because I think the values of apprenticeship are seen as being quite substantial. So that there are people who claim by patrimony, but they're very much a minority, and that they may well have served an apprenticeship in any case. There are also people who are allowed who can buy citizenship. This is called freedom through redemption. They too have to join a company, and the company has to sponsor them, their application for citizenship, but they pay a far higher fee. The apprentices and patrimony freemen pay a few shillings. Redemptioners may pay 10 or 20 pounds. This is in the 16th century. But the point of becoming a citizen is, in some ways I would say it's not so much for the political freedoms or the right to participate in city elections and so on. It's really important because it's the right to open a shop and to own real property, to hold real property, are dependent on citizenship. So that non-citizens are not allowed to open shops. They can still trade in the markets, and obviously, the country traders do that. But it's that the right to trade from a shop and with other individuals, whether they're free or not, that's really important. People who are not citizens are not supposed to be trading except in markets, and are not allowed to trade outside the markets with one another. So it's that economic right that really matters. A number of other things come alongside, including, as it were, the protection of the city's support in disputes, access to the city's courts, and so on. But I think it's the right to open the shop that really matters most of all.
And not political participation, rather opening a shop. This is a good.
Well, I think that's the bottom level, and that obviously, once you have become a householder, once you move in that direction, then obviously, moving through the city hierarchy is something that is expected, and that people expect to move from being an apprentice to being a journeyman or an employee, to becoming a master in their own craft, to being the master of apprentices themselves. So there is, again, a fairly clear progression that people participate in.
Of course. Okay, thank you. Then we have here a question again in the chat from Dominic Kupka, and after that, a question from Judith. Good evening, Dominic Kupka says, I would like to ask you how long the guild masters could remain in their positions. Could they have been elected more than once?
And the answer is yes. Yes, they could be elected more than once, but not normally in succession. It is something that is expected to rotate, so that there will be an election for a master every year or every 2 years, depending on the guild. quite often there will be a series of lesser posts that somebody serves first before they become master, so that different companies have renter wardens or wardens with particular responsibilities, and you serve this post and then you serve that post, and then you are the next person in line to become master of the company. And I should say that some companies have masters, some of them have bailiffs, some of them have wardens, including a prime warden. I mean, the terminology is very varied. But you would normally only serve 1 year or one term as master, and somebody else would succeed you. But you do find, when you look at the biographies of some leading citizens, leading civic officers, that they have served more than once as master of their company. And I assume this is because there was nobody else obvious at the time to take on that office. But it isn't something that is held on a continuous basis, and it isn't something that people do more than a very few times, I would say. There's normally, there's enough people to keep it turning over.
Thank you. Okay, now Judith.
Thank you very much. May I return to a bit to the religious aspect? We already touched it in the questions, but I would go back to the processions and the order within the processions. And I would like to ask you whether you have any documentation on the quarrel concerning this order within the processions, like, for example, the Corpus Christi, or any religious processions which involves the town as such. So when the competition phenomenon can come forward, and whether we see these kind of documents or evidence, written evidence for such kind of quarrels, and if yes, then what were the arguments for who wants to come first and things like this? Thanks.
Yes, I have to say I haven't seen much evidence of such disputes in a way that I've seen them in some other contexts, such as funerals in Paris or something like that. I think, this order of precedence that I mentioned of the 12 great companies, that are an established order coming in, I think that is partly meant to resolve that, or to ensure that disputes do not, as it were, do not reach the public domain. So, the fact that the Skinners and the Merchant Tailors agree to alternate at 6 and 7, I think is a settlement of a dispute that neither of them was happy to give up precedence to the other. They both felt that on the basis of their size and importance that they should be 6th, and it has to be an outside authority that says, the only way to resolve this is for you to alternate. So, that order doesn't emerge in its final form. Sorry, it evolves a bit towards its final form, but it is definitely becoming clear by the end of the 15th century that there is a sense that the order of precedence, starts with the Mercers and then goes on through the others that I've listed. But I haven't. Well, I think it would be that if there are records of such disputes, then they're the sorts of things that will have been picked up by the records of early English drama volumes, which have recently been published covering London. And I haven't looked for such things. So there may be ones, and I think, those ought to record ones at a civic level. I think there may be, as it were, smaller scale disputes within companies about precedence in local events, things that they're doing, and that those would come up in the court minutes, in the court minutes generally, or in any regulations that they that they create as a result of that. But again, I haven't gone deeply enough into those records to be able to cite any.
Thank you very much.
Christina, you want to say something?
I would like to ask something, actually. Thank you very much for this extremely inspiring paper. I was wondering, because you touched upon foreigners for a very short mention, and you were mentioning the citizenship, lack of citizenship, which is very important, obviously, in modern, early modern and medieval times in urban context. But I was wondering if there were similar organizations, probably religious ones, established by foreigners living in London, maybe fraternities, because there are some similar cases in Europe, in medieval Europe, 15th century Florence. There is this confraternity of the German cobblers, which was very nicely functioning, and even without citizenship also, they were very capable of defending their own members' interests in a way. So I was wondering if what was the situation in London?
Right. Well, I mean, one thing to start off with is that the term foreign is rather confusing in London, because it's used, as also is the term stranger by the 16th century, it's used to mean those who are not citizens, as well as those who are actually from abroad, or aliens in the technical term. So sometimes when they're talking about foreigners and foreign workers, they actually mean non-citizens. They mean immigrants from other parts of England. And that mostly that is what the companies are worried about. When they're talking about foreign workers, they mean non-citizen workers, and that they don't like the fact that they are either taking work that citizens ought to be having, or that they're actually being employed by citizens when those citizens should themselves be sticking to the rules and employing only those who have become free of the city. In terms of forming groups for self-defense, well, obviously there is the German merchants, the Hanseatic merchants have a strong identity and indeed a stronghold in the Steelyard, and belong, as it were, quite clearly a sort of close and intense relationship within that community. But they don't have a separate church. They do use London parish churches. Italian merchants seem to have had a fraternity in the Austin Friars, the Augustinian Friars, and who are more welcoming to overseas groups than some of London's other religious houses. And there may be comparatively small-scale groupings, but one of the things that the city is really worried about, in a sense, is that foreigners and strangers should not be forming interest groups or pressure groups of their own. That they should be, subject to the city's regulations and not forming competing groups or identities that might undermine the authority of the city. That said, I suppose there are sort of one or two areas where there do seem to be distinct groups of foreign or alien-born workers, such as the foreign or alien weavers, who eventually merged with the English-born weavers. But there are no, I'm just trying to think, there may be some confraternities that I can't bring to mind at the moment, but there are no organizations that really resemble the city companies that are formed for aliens or strangers.
Thank you very much. Yes, weavers are very apt to and a very strong interest group. So and they were usually very important for the urban community and the urban industry as well. So they are a special case in all areas, I think. But thank you very much for your answer.
Can I actually just come back on that, because it is interesting that the weavers, though a very early guild, aren't anywhere near the top when the precedence is established. And it's cloth workers and merchant tailors who are textile workers who are, I mean, those are the companies near the top. The weavers are quite modestly off by that stage, but they are, as you say, dealing with this tension between the English weavers, the foreign weavers, and also the introduction of silk weaving, which is essentially an imported technique, and with all the characteristics of an import of that kind. That's to say, is that the craftsmen, the materials, the expertise are only slowly, as it were, naturalized in London.
Thank you very much.
Again, a question in the chat. Agnes Flora, good evening. I was just thinking if marriage was a condition for citizenship and they ought to marry shortly after becoming citizens.
Right. No, it's actually the other way around. They are not allowed to marry as apprentices. And, you know, given the tendency for people not to marry until they can form a separate household, people will tend to postpone marriage until some years after becoming citizens. I mean, we can't say very much about this in the medieval period, but by the 16th century, when there is a fairly clear pattern of marriage in London, which is that men and women are not marrying till their mid-20s or later. I mean, most men will come out of their apprenticeship at sort of 24 or 25, but they probably won't marry for 2 or 3 years after that, if by that time they can have set up a viable business or at least resources on which to support a family. It is true that almost every citizen male will marry at some time or another. It's extremely unusual, for example, for there to be a Lord Mayor who's not married and has never been married, but there are 1 or 2. So becoming a husband as well as a householder is part of the life pattern for many citizens, but it's not one that they embark on very early.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's also worth saying is that marriage is a matter of business, and that a good number of, well, apprentices do sometimes marry into their master's family. Sometimes they marry their master's widow. And so that in that sense, they're embedded even more closely into the master-apprentice relationship.
Oh yeah, there is the last question for Zoe. Hello.
Hello from Birkbeck, Vanessa. Thank you so much for this. I couldn't resist. Sorry. And in fact, I'm so sorry I was a bit late because of the exam boards happening. As you know, at the moment, it's all very busy. I just, you know, as you were talking, I was one thing that came back to my mind with my kind of, art historical way of thinking is I remember the V&A Opus Anglicanum exhibition, and right at the end, there was this wonderful fishmonger's pole, there was this kind of covering from the 16th century still surviving and still apparently owned by them. So I just wanted to ask you about that kind of visual language and when does that develop? And this is a very spectacular and very expensive things, and there were some others. And how visible that was all around London, in terms of donations and kind of shop fronts and kind of corporate imagery, slightly crude term, but that it was quite kind of very articulate, very elaborate and expensive. Was that common? Was that was there a competition there in terms of their visual presence?
I'm sure there is competition there. Yes, I mean I think probably all the greater companies have hearse cloths or palls of that kind, of which quite a few do now survive. From the pre-Reformation or the 16th century period. They tend to go out of fashion after that, which may be one thing that helps them to survive. But yes, they are like the church hangings and the vestments that up to the time of the Reformation are clearly immensely important to companies, to parishes, to parish churches, to fraternities and so on. I mean, Londoners are very well placed for being able to invest in these wonderful textiles because they're coming into the city, because the London's companies and fraternities are comparatively rich, and because I think there is this real sense of competitive display, competitive consumption. Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned the plate that they use at their dinners, and that accumulating plate is obviously important. They have banners, there are the robes and the gowns and so on. I'm just trying to think. There must be cases in which there are complete sets of ecclesiastical vestments donated by company men that in some way commemorate the company as well. I mean, certainly the badges that I showed, what come to be part of their coats of arms, I mean, those are scattered all over the city, even now. And I think that those are clearly one way in which membership is proclaimed and an identity carried forward. I mean, as you probably know, on the grounds of clothing, on the basis of clothing overall, is that what the mayor wears, what the sheriffs wear, what the aldermen wear, what the deputies wear, what kind of cloth, what kind of fur, what colour, and so on. I mean, these are all incredibly detailed specifications.
Carefully coded,
Yes.
Thank you, that was really terrific. I enjoyed it very much.
Good. I think we can slowly close this event. Thank you again, Vanessa, for your lecture and also for answering questions for so long, almost an hour. And now I would say we are fully informed about guild fraternity in London, and we're looking forward to your new book that you are preparing.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for the questions. That's been, a great response, a great engagement. Thank you.
I think we also can announce the next week. I have to check. I think it's Martin Scheutz. Huh?
I think so.
Yeah, it's Martin Scheutz, who was also present, but who had to log out a bit earlier. Martin Scheutz from the University of Vienna, armed citizens in town, control of weapons and armories. So this is a bit another subject than yours, but has to do with the self-defense of the cities, of course. So I hope to see you next week, all of you, and then wish you a nice weekend in between. And goodbye. Thank you again, Vanessa.